Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. This is Insightful Leader Live. I'm Jess Love, editor-in-chief of Kellogg Insight. Today, we're going to be speaking with the healthcare economist Amanda Starc about the prescription drug market here in the US. First, I did want to plug a webinar we're going to be hosting 2 weeks from now at the same time. That would be Thursday, February 29th. We're going to be talking with Nicola Persico, another economist here at Kellogg, and he'll be tackling a really interesting and I think provocative question, which is 30 years from now, will the US's economy look a lot like Italy's does today? So that should be fascinating. Before we start today's webinar, just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be closing the chat box soon, so leave all of your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to have a lot of time for those today. You can also upvote each other's questions. Closed captioning isn't available. That's accessed via live transcript at the bottom of the screen. And yes, this event is being recorded. You'll get a link to it soon. So I am so pleased to introduce Amanda Starc. She's an associate professor of strategy here at Kellogg. She's conducted research on a whole bunch of different parts of the healthcare industry, from insurance exchanges and Medicare to hospital investments. And she's also studied the prescription drug market, which is the topic she's agreed to talk with us about today. So if you have questions about it, and you probably do, I certainly do, it is very complicated, then you are in good hands. She's going to begin with a brief presentation, and then we're going to launch into questions. So welcome, Professor Starc.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you folks today, thinking a little bit about drug pricing and how we can think about drug pricing reform going forward. You know, what's really interesting, as Jess pointed out, is that drug pricing in the US, it's pretty complex, and the institutions are sort of opaque, right? It's hard to disentangle what's going on. And it's important to understand what's going on because as we think about various reforms, you know, we have to think about the key trade-offs involved. So if we're interested in reducing drug prices, we also have to think about the access trade-offs, right? If we reduce the returns to innovating within the pharmaceutical space, you know, we're going to get less investment, and that might mean less access in the future. And so we have to understand a little bit more about the process in order to think through what the impact of various reforms will be. And so today, what I'm going to do to kick us off is that I'm just going to highlight some of the complexities that exist within the drug pricing system. Okay. In order to do that, I'm going to pull from a sort of white paper that I wrote with Craig Garthwaite, who's the head of our healthcare program here, that we wrote for the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, which you'll totally get a link to. So no need to take furious notes. You'll get all of this later. It is a 52-page document, as it turns out, because what our goal was to put all of the information that we sort of knew from various sources into one spot. And because this is a complicated system, that ended up being a pretty long document. So rather than having you read 52 pages of text, we're going to walk through some pictures that'll help tee up many of the questions that I'm sure you'll have. Okay. And so the first thing I want to point out is that we all have this sense that drug prices are rising. Okay. But when we're talking about drug prices, we're actually talking about a couple of different things floating around. There's sort of a public list price. You should think of this as almost like the MSRP on a car. It's sort of the starting point of a negotiation, but except in rare circumstances, it's unlikely that anyone is actually paying that amount. There's also the net price. That's the price that is paid by insurance companies after they negotiate with those pharmaceutical manufacturers. And then, of course, there are out-of-pocket payments made by consumers. And those are often the things that consumers are most salient to consumers, right? How much do I have to actually pay when I get to the pharmacy? So when we think about all of those prices are going to be determined by a range of factors like competition and payer type and the way in which drugs are administered. And so understanding the distribution of spending is crucial in this context. Okay? And so what do we know about drug prices? Well, this idea that drug prices are rising definitely comes from somewhere. But the main idea there is that list prices are rising. This is sort of the equivalent of that MSRP from a car dealership, and those are certainly rising. They're rising dramatically, and I think you see that in my leftmost panel here. When thinking about the wholesale acquisition cost, right? So this is a measure of the list price that is going up over time for sure. Now, when we think about what the manufacturer is actually receiving, we have to take these discounts into account. And once we take those discounts into effect, that relationship is a little bit flatter. And so while the list price is rising and the net price is going up, the net price isn't going up nearly as much as the list price is. Okay? And so that leads to the last piece of the puzzle, which is what you folks all pay when you end up at the pharmacy. We'll come back to that in a second. Now, that is not to say that all is well, because list prices are rising faster than sort of net prices. It's definitely the case that drug prices in the US are significantly higher than production cost. And we could think that that's a bad thing, right? That means that pharmaceutical manufacturers are earning real economic profits because they're able to charge prices higher than their cost of production. Now, of course, in order to bring those products to market, they needed to do some research and development, and it's exactly those profits that are incentivizing that research and development. And so I think it's important for us to think about the overall value that we're getting in the system, because what we should have in mind is ways in which we can modify the existing system, which the government plays a heavy role in, with the aim of increasing value, not simply lower prices for the sake of lower prices. Okay? And in order to think about that, we need to think a little bit about how a drug gets to you, the patient. Okay? And here things get a little complicated. Okay? And so here's sort of an idea of the supply chain. I think it is worth pointing out that the complicated thing when it comes to drugs is not the sort of physical supply chain per se. If we sort of think at if we take a look at the first panel of that bigger figure, okay, if we just think about products are made by a manufacturer who might sell to a wholesaler or might sell directly to a pharmacy who dispenses the prescription to you, the patient. That basic flow, like there's a manufacturer, there might be a wholesaler, there's a retailer, that would be true in a range of other industries. There's nothing all that unusual there. What is unusual is the financial relationships and the financial relationships that give rise to some of those net prices. So unlike a simple widget that you buy from a store, when you're buying a prescription drug, you are probably using your insurance plan, okay, to defray some of that cost. Okay? And so what does that mean? That means that you, the consumer, are paying insurance premiums in one form or another, okay, to a third-party payer or a health plan. That health plan is probably using an entity called a pharmacy benefit manager to negotiate those lower drug prices. Okay? So what are they going to think about when they're thinking about those negotiations? Basically, they're going to say to the manufacturer, look, I'm going to put you on a more preferred position on the formulary if you're willing to cut me a deal on this drug. Okay? And so that's going to mean that relative to those list prices that you see in the news, the drug manufacturers are willing to give your pharmacy benefit manager, and perhaps therefore your health plan, sort of a 25 to 30% discount on average, right? And why is that? Because if they don't give them that discount, your pharmacy benefit manager is going to make that drug more expensive to you in the form of out-of-pocket payments, okay? And I'm an economist, so I'm pretty sure demand slopes down, and that's going to mean lower quantities. And if we have lower quantities, that's going to generate that real trade-off for the manufacturer. Okay? Now, the natural question from there is, what on earth happens to these rebates? Okay, so the pharmacy benefit manager, which is often also kind of maligned in the press, so far I've told you this great story about how they are negotiating discounts on the behalf of you, the consumer. Okay? The natural question is, what happens to those rebates that they collect? Okay? And depending on the relationship that they have with your health insurer, that might determine what's going to happen to some of those rebates. Okay? And so this figure just shows that for some plans, all of those rebates get passed through to the health plan, which probably means lower premiums to you, the consumer. Okay. In other cases, the health plan might get a percentage share of rebates, or they might get a flat guaranteed amount, okay, which means that the pharmacy benefit manager might be able to keep a bit more in the form of a bit more of those rebates in the form of profits for themselves. Okay. And so that's what they're doing on the negotiating side. And I said one of the things they might do is move drugs around on the formulary in order to steer consumers to one drug or another. Of course, their ability to move drugs around on the formulary has important consequences for consumers, not just because it allows them to negotiate different discounts from the manufacturers, but also because that really affects the quality of the insurance product that you, the consumer, get. Okay? And so in particular, if your health plan, is looking to avoid particularly high cost enrollees who take expensive drugs, one of the things you can do is put those drugs on a less generous position on the formulary. And that's really unfortunate for consumers because it unwinds some of that insurance benefit that we had in mind. Okay, so this figure just goes through that exercise within the context of Medicare. So these are folks 65 and up. And it basically says, look, on average, when it comes to Medicare prescription drug coverage, we have unwound a lot of the insurance benefit of having insurance for some of these very expensive drugs. Okay? These are often biologics, but they need not be. And so what this is going to mean, the dark blue bar is just the average premium cost. And then the light blue bar includes the expected drug cost given the copays we expect the consumer has to pay. And we see that for, lots of drugs for which there are generics, that total cost of those copays is relatively low, whereas for some big and expensive blockbuster drugs, it's quite high. Now, it's important to point out that that's not solely the choice of the manufacturer. That's the choice of both the manufacturer, the pharmacy benefit manager, and the health plan. And so as we're thinking about things that we can do, okay, to guarantee that we're creating that value for consumers, we can think about various proposals that might limit cost sharing. We could also think about making sure we have as much competition as possible within the system. And what's interesting here is unlike, that sort of Econ 101 world where there's lots of consumers and lots of firms who are all competing and they're competing prices down to something that looks like the cost of production, that's sort of not true here. And that's not true here for a couple of reasons. One is that we've given these drug manufacturers patent protection, and we've done that on purpose to incentivize that innovation. At the same time, we have a relatively small number of drug manufacturers and a relatively small number of pharmacy benefit managers. And so we sort of have this fragile balance going on. And so we have to think about competition carefully. One place where I think of there being sort of a competition success story is thinking about retail pharmacies, where it turns out folks don't care that much if their pharmacy benefit manager sends them to CVS or Walgreens, and that allows them to negotiate lower dispensing fees from both. Okay, and then there's, there's more detail in the paper, but there's a bunch of sort of bad existing policy that we can clean up, like paying cost plus for drugs in Medicare Part B as in boy. So there are some things that we can do that I think is low-hanging fruit. Beyond that, we want to definitely ensure competition, and we want to ensure that insurance is doing what we intend it to do. And beyond that, we have some hard trade-offs to make. And those hard trade-offs come about because the profits that the drug companies expect to earn because they have patent protection and are able to command high prices for innovative products, okay, is exactly what incentivizes them to do that research and development in the first place. So I know that I've touched on a wide range of topics. This was just meant to get a conversation started, and I look forward to answering a bunch of your questions.
Thank you so much. Well, you are in luck because we do have a lot of questions for you. You've talked a lot about costs, and we're definitely going to get there. But I wanted to start with some places where it feels like the incentives are not right to generate innovation. And so I'll give you an example, but I'd be curious, if you could put that in perspective, what other examples are there like this? And then what are the things we could do? So I think a very obvious example that came to mind is like new antibiotics. And so companies make them and they sit on the shelf, which is how it should be because we don't want people to develop resistance to those antibiotics. But then the poor company that develops these antibiotics makes no money. And so they stop doing it. And so this feels like a system that isn't working. I'm wondering how many other types of drugs are like that? And what are the types of things that we could do to actually make sure that people want to develop the next generation of antibiotics?
Okay, good. So, to answer your question, I want to take a step back and think about what a pharmaceutical manufacturer is looking for when they're thinking about developing a new drug. If you're a drug manufacturer, what is ideal from your standpoint? Well, the ideal drug is one that generates value. That's good. For a large number of patients, that's probably good. Who have pretty good insurance, which could go either way, right? And even better if they kind of have to take it a lot, right? Because that's going to generate revenue each time they take it as opposed to a once and for all. And so as you point out, antibiotics sort of fail that last test. Okay, the best antibiotic in some sense is the one we don't need. And so having that ability to treat bacterial infections as they arise is extremely valuable. You're exactly right that there's this externality that we could develop resistance. And furthermore, it's probably a one-time treatment, right? And so that's going to mean that the returns to developing that type of drug are lower than they might be somewhere else. We've seen this in other places as well. So Medicare for folks 65 and up offers fairly generous reimbursement of drugs relative to, say, Medicaid, which is for historically low-income populations, which offers less generous coverage. So as you expand Medicare coverage of drugs, you get more drugs that are great for folks that are 65 and up. And if they happen to be good for younger folks, that's nice, but that wasn't the goal. Okay. By contrast, the types of things that would be really useful to the Medicaid population, you're just going to get less investment in because there's less money there. In the extreme, okay, and I'm sure you'll ask me about US drug prices relative to other countries, but in the extreme, innovation is tilted towards what Americans need, right? And why is that? Well, that's where the money is, right? And so, you talk about antibiotics, like we don't get a ton of anti-malarial drugs either, because it turns out that the willingness to pay, not because they do not generate a ton of clinical value, but because of the sort of baseline income of the folks that need them the most is just lower, right? And so we absolutely get a tilt of innovation towards the products that generate the highest willingness to pay, right? And that's going to mean that in many ways, the investments that we get in practice are kind of not optimal, right? They're not what a benevolent dictator would necessarily pick to sort of maximize the most good for the most people or something like that. They are generated by market incentives. Okay. Now, in many ways, that's a good thing, right? Because market incentives are powerful. Those prices send valuable information to pharmaceutical manufacturers about what consumers value and what they should invest in. At the same time, and so you have to ask yourself, am I really smarter than that market? Am I a better benevolent dictator than the market here? And maybe there are some obvious places where we can make improvements. I think antibiotics is one example. And here, folks have suggested various systems to incentivize more innovation. So We can think about making big, having the NIH make big investments, setting up prizes, setting up guarantees that the government will buy them. Basically I think the other example of this is when we were trying to get the COVID vaccines to market. We'll try anything, right? Like our willingness to pay is basically infinite. We're all stuck in our houses. And so we'll try a variety of subsidies and prizes and pre-market guarantees to try to get those drugs to market. And I think to the extent that there's political will to do that in other spaces, you could expect the same thing.
So how much of drug development happens in private companies right now, and is shifting that balance away to potentially, for instance, increase antibiotic production and some of these other kind of pieces that are currently left out?
Good. I think this is really a yes and so sometimes in the popular debate, someone will argue that the most offensive thing about these high drug prices is that we've sort of paid for these things twice, right? We subsidized the innovation in the first place, and now we're also allowing you to charge high prices. And there's a little bit of truth to that, right? We absolutely subsidize innovation, but the type of innovation that we subsidize is like closer to that basic science than bringing the drug to market. And we absolutely need both of those things, right? And so, a government grant is going to be great at figuring out, what mRNA does. I'm not a scientist. I'm married to one, but it doesn't all filter through at dinner. It's very good at figuring out what the heck mRNA does. It's not very good at getting an mRNA vaccine through clinical trials, okay, and bringing it to market and getting production up and running, right? So this is really a yes and. We need that initial stage innovation, especially when the type of knowledge that we're creating looks more like a public good, right? Once we know how mRNA works, everyone kind of knows how it works, and we probably published it in a scientific journal, okay? It's really hard to get a private firm to undertake the cost of generating that broad knowledge. That's a great role for government. But the government's probably not that good at bringing an individual drug to market, okay? And so there we're going to need private firms as well. And so we should think about, we pay for the general knowledge on the front end, and then we pay for bringing it to market later.
So let's talk about those clinical trials. I personally like the fact that we have them and that I feel pretty good about what I am taking. But I do wonder if there are places where we could make that the FDA approval process, for instance, faster or more efficient, because it seems like there's a couple different problems right now. As you say, it's really tough for somebody to kind of without a giant budget to sort of take things through the process. So like a small company, for instance, they're going to have to partner with a bigger company or maybe get bought up by the bigger company. Which seems like it, first of all, reduces competition in the industry, and then it also so I guess that that's one area where you could potentially benefit from a more efficient process. And then of course there's also the question of like, well, if we shaved some of these steps out of the process, let your husband scientist rather than you figure out which ones, could we then like get to market faster and just have a better system?
Good. So I think a natural place to think about streamlining the FDA approval process, less on clinical trials, but on the approval process, is generic drugs. And so when we think about generic drugs, like the great thing about pharmaceutical innovation is like, yeah, the prices might be high today, but one day this drug is going to go off patent, at which point those market forces are going to drive down the cost, right? So what do we need though? We need to get those cheaper alternatives to market. And, we have a reference drug that is deemed to be safe and effective by the FDA. And we spend a lot of time, and there's in fact historically been a pretty long backlog in getting approval to sell generics. Now, why does this matter? Well, in part, this matters because we want to get that competition as soon as possible. At the same time, we've seen some, I talked a little bit about guaranteeing competition in this space. We've seen, for example, collusion among generic drug manufacturers. What's going to guarantee that collusion sort of breaks down? Well, one thing is you can bring in a bunch of new entrants, right? And so this is something we can do to ensure competition in the market exactly when we expect it to be. When it comes to, and that's a place when we think about generics, there's like the trade-offs aren't that hard to think about, right? Because we already know these things are safe and effective. We need to guarantee good manufacturing practices, and maybe we should, step up post-approval surveillance. But from a approval standpoint, this is pretty straightforward. So then that brings us to the question of clinical trials. Clinical trials are really tough to run, and they're expensive, and I can only imagine they're extremely nerve-wracking. And so I think anything we can think through that reduces that fixed cost without reducing the safety profile, I think reasonable people could argue that the FDA is in fact too conservative. And they require too much from clinical trials. Again, I'm not a real doctor, so I don't have a strong stand there, but I think it is worth thinking about the fact that clinical trials do serve as a major barrier to entry in this industry. And so it is worth taking the economics into account when you're thinking about the role that these clinical trials play. And so if we can reduce the cost of running clinical trials while maintaining the rigor that reasonable medical professionals would expect, that seems reasonable. Now, we've seen a little bit of that in the medical device space, where traditionally it's been a little bit easier to get approval in the EU relative to the US. And you see in practice that doctors learn. Doctors are smart folks. We give them a lot of autonomy for a reason. And so we can make a system that allows them to use their expertise in meaningful ways.
So you mentioned something in passing about collusion in the generic drug market. So as we kind of shift the conversation to drug spending, generics, as you say, is a real opportunity here. That's kind of like the holy grail of actually being able to reduce drug costs. And I know you've done research on this. Can you just flesh out a little bit? What is the collusion that we are seeing in this market?
Good. So, when we think about generic drugs, as you point out, we think of this as like the competition success story, right? And as a health economist, you don't get that many competition success stories in the industry. But one of the things that we saw in the past decade or so is that a bunch of prices for generic drugs sort of spiked. And there's a bunch of reasons that's true. The pharma bro Martin Shkreli is one example where he basically just took a drug with a small patient population and was like, this is like basically a natural monopoly, and I'm going to jack up the price and patients be damned. And then other shenanigans ensue, and he ends up in prison. That is like one set of things. Then another set of things that have happened is that there was just a cartel, right? And so basically what happened is that one of the major generic drug manufacturers hired a woman from one of the major wholesalers who knew all of her competitors, and just good old-fashioned price fixing ensued. And so what we do in our research is we say, look, we see the prices go up dramatically. If the prices go up dramatically, what should we expect to happen? There are real economic profits being earned here. We should expect other firms to enter and compete those profits away. Now, what's interesting is that they don't exactly want to break this cartel, right? Because if you break the cartel, prices go back to competitive levels, and at competitive levels, you didn't want to get into the market. But there is this sort of intermediate ground where you can come in and lower the prices and still earn real profits. And so we sort of document that. And one of the big things that we show is that the delays at the FDA of bringing, generic I'm trying to generic simvastatin, I'm not sure this is in our data set, but generic simvastatin to market, are on the order of magnitude of 2 to 3 years. And in the meantime, these firms that are colluding are earning very high profits on the backs of consumers, right? And the real problem is that that competition is not happening, and we're not getting new firms into the market. And so this is sort of the classic example of, we want to ensure competition, okay, not just for low prices, but because that leads to more efficient outcomes.
So just to make sure we get to some of these audience questions here, I have I think one that's a little bit representative of the outrage a lot of patients face when they see that something is, only costs $2 and yet it's costing them thousands of dollars. So I can't verify these facts. This comes from one of our audience members, but I think it is very representative. So I'm about to start a biweekly drug infusion protocol that with Medicare will cost $2,000 a pop. Without insurance, it would be $7,500 per infusion. If I'm indigent, will only be $5. But anyone who makes more than $100,000 a year has to pay $2,000 per infusion. This makes no sense to me. This drug is for an autoimmune situation and my health is dependent on it. Why are pharma companies not being held accountable for these huge discrepancies?
Absolutely. So first of all, I hope this takes care of the issue, and I'm sorry you're going through this. I think it is worth pointing out that kind of everyone sucks here. Okay. And so the first point is like, why is the same drug being sold to different consumers at wildly different price points? This is a basic idea of price discrimination, right? The indigent patient doesn't have $2,000 a month. They don't have $7,500 a month. The manufacturer would rather sell to them at any price above cost. And if they can come up with a way to charge different consumers different prices, that is going to allow them to earn higher profits. It's the same reason you get coupons for some things and not others, right? So that's sort of the first piece of what the manufacturer is doing. They're de facto offering kind of coupons to some consumers, but not others, for the same reason that General Mills offers some people, or targets some people with coupons for Honey Nut Cheerios, right? So that's the first piece. They are absolutely doing that because that increases their profits, right? Now there's another piece, which is, I think, and I'm going to dangerously try to share my slide again, which is, where on earth did this $2,000 number come from? And so I think you should be able to see my screen. And so on this screen, with no additional information, my guess is that one of the protocols that you're taking is sort of somewhere up here on the top half of the figure, right? These are expensive biological drugs. And so just to be clear, the difference here is between a biologic, okay, which is made by sort of a natural process, and a small molecule drug, which can be made in a lab. So, aspirin is a small molecule drug. My chemist husband could make it. You shouldn't take the one that he made, but he could make it. He cannot make what you are about to be infused with, okay? And so then the question is, well, how on earth do we come up with this $2,000 number? Okay, I bought insurance. I thought the insurance should cover this. The problem is, the insurance company kind of doesn't want you. And they don't want you because you're about to start taking in an expensive drug, right? And so because that is not going to be, because you're not a particularly profitable patient from the insurer's point of view, what they're going to do is that they're going to apply fairly high cost sharing to that drug. Let's think about what would happen if they would try to be a little bit more generous. So instead of having this drug at a $2,000 copay, let's say they said, oh, you know what, this is absolutely medically necessary. We will absolutely make sure we offer this with a $20 copay. Well, the problem is that everyone else that is taking the same drug is going to flock to that insurance plan, right? And they're now going to have a bunch of really expensive enrollees. Okay? And because they're going to have a bunch of really expensive enrollees, that's going to harm their profitability. Because of that, they don't particularly want to offer generous coverage of these drugs. Okay, so this is the sense in which everyone kind of sucks here, right? The pharmaceutical manufacturer, and like not in some diabolical way, everyone's just profit maximizing given the rules that Medicare has put in place. But that profit maximization is going to end up with a situation where you absolutely see differences across different kinds of people and what consumers are being charged for these drugs, and this unwinding of the insurance benefit that I think is actually quite harmful, right? Because this is bad for two reasons. One, you're out of pocket a lot, right? Two, it might mean that other folks who can't afford that don't get the medications that they need. And three, the point of insurance is that we are mitigating the financial risk of needing one of these drugs. And because of the way that the system is set up, there's an unwinding of that insurance effect. And so thinking about creative ways that we can cap cost sharing so that we can still allow your pharmacy benefit manager to negotiate discounts for these drugs while protecting the consumer from these outsized out-of-pocket payment amounts is reasonable. Okay? So that was a really long way of saying the manufacturer is profit maximizing, the insurer is profit maximizing, and the incentives created as a result lead to high cost sharing.
And this is true even if the insurer is the government. Like, how does that change the equation?
So say more. When you say the insurer is the government, what do you mean?
If we're talking about Medicare, for instance.
Okay, good. So that figure, in fact, was for Medicare Part D. D as in dog. So Medicare Part D, it's also possible, by the way, for the particular question asker, it's also possible that this is being covered by B as in boy. I'm gonna like totally gloss over that fact for the time being. That's a Medicare problem. But this was for prescription drug coverage within Medicare. Now, the interesting thing about prescription drug coverage within Medicare, when we created Medicare in 1965, there weren't that many drug therapies. And so we didn't offer drug coverage. Over time, drugs became a bigger part of what we can do for folks, okay? And they became more expensive. And so there was a lot of clamoring for prescription drug coverage. And so this was a big feature of the 2000 election. There were a lot of ads where, Nana has to decide between paying her electricity bill this month and filling her medication, right? And this was a big point of contention. And so during the Bush administration, we passed the Medicare prescription drug, I forget the name of the act off the top of my head, but we enacted Part D. Now, this is a Republican administration, and so part of the idea was that we would use private insurers to spur innovation and keep costs down. Okay, and so when we talk about Medicare Part D, every Medicare Part D plan is being offered by a private insurer. Now, it is heavily subsidized by the federal government. So if we're thinking about those premium dollars, about 75 cents on the dollar to a rough approximation is being paid by the government. But your insurer is Humana or Cigna or Blue Cross Blue Shield, right? And so we live in a country that has a mixture of public and private actors sort of delivering healthcare goods and services. And it's important to think through those interactions. So if it's Medicare Part D, it's being administered by a private insurer, but heavily subsidized by the government.
So this one is going to dip into philosophy a little bit for you, Amanda.
I was a philosophy minor in college, so I'm ready to go.
Oh my gosh. I'm setting you up then. So how do we factor the marginal utility of many of today's pharmaceutical advancements with the fact that they're driving significant increases in costs? So the philosophical way of putting this is, will society be okay with saying no to paying for a small gain at a huge cost?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And so historically in the US, we don't say no to stuff, right? To a first approximation, things that have demonstrable clinical benefit, regardless of the cost, we typically, to a first approximation, say yes. That's not true around the world, right? And so other countries are able to negotiate lower prices for drugs because they absolutely are willing to say no to things. And even within the Medicaid program within the US, we say no to more stuff. And that in part leads to lower prices. And so here we have a real question of sort of aggregating everyone's preferences, right? It's a philosophical question because it's basically asking the question, what does it mean to live in a democracy? And so we have to figure out what we're willing as a society to pay for. And I used to teach undergraduates when I was at Wharton before I smartly moved to Kellogg. And one of the things I would ask my undergraduates, and this was 10 years ago now, but I would ask them, like, look, okay, let's think about the innovation in healthcare versus the innovation in everything else since 1950. Which would you rather have? And of course, they'd like stare down at their phones and they'd be like, I want this thing, right? I don't care about all that healthcare innovation. And then you take a step back and you're like, okay, well, let's talk about what that really means. And my favorite story about this is when he was in office, Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack. And when he had a heart attack in 1950 or whatever, the only treatment was essentially to tell him to lay down for 6 weeks and hope for the best, right? And so, in fact, I've visited it's now a college campus, but the VA hospital, he was in Denver at the time, the VA hospital in Denver, there was a room where Dwight Eisenhower just laid there, for a month or whatever. Kind of hoped he got better. It's great because outside the door has all of his titles, and he has a lot of titles, right? So he's like commander in chief and Supreme Allied Commander, all of these things. And you're like, oh my gosh, the president got nothing for something that today would probably be an outpatient procedure, right? We'd put in a drug-eluting stent, we'd make sure you were on a statin and some beta blockers, and we'd send you on your way. And suddenly, when you're thinking about what we're spending on healthcare, that difference seems quite big, right? So we get a lot of value on average, right? And that's almost certainly, we're a rich country. It is reasonable to say that's what we want to spend our money on. At the same time, on the margin, we maybe don't get that much value, right? So the marginal improvement might be quite small, might be very expensive, and give us very little in terms of additional healthy years. And so that's a really tough, there's sort of a logical problem there that's really hard to wrap your head around. On average, the innovation that we've managed to accomplish, and to be clear, drugs are a big part of that. So if we think about the gains in life expectancy since 1980 or so, we think about a third of that is attributable to better drugs. And so, like, on average, it's a really great deal, yet on the margin, we get these marginal improvements that maybe we're not willing to pay for. And it's really hard to think through how to incentivize those things. So that was a long-winded answer that says living in a democracy is tough, and measuring the value of technological innovation is tough too.
Well, this question will be nice and short.
Okay.
Is AI the answer? Is that going to solve it? Is that going to bring down costs?
So you could imagine, I think it is worth thinking through what AI could do. I think one of the places where we've seen increased use of AI is maybe in the discovery process. So, and this is sort of a change in degree, not a change in kind. So, if we think about how we develop drugs, increasingly we know much more. We've made a lot of investments in understanding the basic biology, physiology, science, right? And we have much more science-driven drug discovery, as opposed to the old system, which is like, let's find something that does something in your body and hope what it does is good. And so one of the things that you could easily imagine AI doing is speeding up that process. So given that we know that this compound does X and this compound does Y, if we put them together, would it do more than the sum of its parts or something like that? And so I think you could easily see that accelerating the pace of drug discovery. I think it will be a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. And so, I don't know that you'll necessarily be able to measure the difference. And so, but I think it's a great question. And I think folks are working hard to figure out how to best utilize those tools to do what they were already doing.
So we are getting a number of questions in about generics. So I'm going to read one of them. I work in the generic injectable drug industry. Multiple manufacturers locally have gone bankrupt. Right now, there are shortages all over due to manufacturers either exiting or having manufacturer issues. Do you see the generic industry surviving this environment?
Okay, good. So I talked about generics, 5 or 10 minutes ago. I was talking about collusion and high prices, and that was bad. And this was all like small molecule drugs that are like pretty easy to manufacture, and not the like sterile injectables. Now, the irony for things like sterile injectables is these things are hard to make. The quality is tough to verify ex ante, and we probably pay too little for them, right? And so if we're thinking about how to guarantee that we have, a consistent supply of high quality, intravenous antibiotics, chemotherapy agents, when these things are generic and prices are getting compressed down to something that looks like the marginal cost of production, it might be that we actually just want to pay a little bit more to guarantee that the firms can deliver on this. Now, that should not be in, just here's more money. You want to put some safeguards in place. But this is a tricky problem, and it's a place where the narrative that drug prices is too high is exactly backwards.
So I want to make sure we do talk a little bit about other countries. And we're getting some questions about these as well. Um, so you mentioned earlier that manufacturers are really good at creating drugs that are going to benefit the American market, and in particular, the kind of wealthy, well-insured American market.
Yes, the global north, American is too specific, but a profitable segment of the market for sure.
And so I think this kind of hits along the lines of this perception that some people have, and I'm curious whether it's true or not, that the US is responsible for kind of funding a disproportionate amount of the drug innovation around the world. And if we were to make some changes to kind of cut back our spending on new drugs, that would actually have a really big impact globally. Is that true? Is that story a little simplistic? What do you think?
Yeah, so sometimes this gets phrased as like we're subsidizing the rest of the world with our high prices, which that's a little too simplistic. The way you actually phrased it, I don't think is too simplistic, right? Look, there's a sense in which the prices that we pay are higher than the prices paid in other countries. That gets back to that price discrimination point I was talking about earlier. And so, is that good or bad? It feels a little unfair, right? That seems very natural. But at the same time, what's the better alternative? In some sense, are we going to cut off our nose to spite our face here? I don't know. And the other thing folks sometimes recommend is like let's implement some reference pricing, which other countries do, or let's allow imports from Canada. What that's going to do is lead to higher prices in Canada, right? Canada is very small relative to us. And so it's going to mean if you can only set one price for the US and Canada, it's going to be a whole heck of a lot closer to the US price than the Canadian price. And so I think this is sometimes a little bit of a red herring, because it is a visceral reaction to say, yeah, this does feel kind of unfair. And I think that's very normal. But I think the follow-up, which is like, well, what is the proposed solution to that problem? And how can we guarantee that we're getting that innovation that we want, while sort of spreading the burden a little bit more fairly?
Are there pieces of other countries' prescription drug policies that benevolent dictator Amanda Starc would take and implement here in the US?
I don't know. So I think one thing that's true and that I'm sure has come through to many listeners is that we have a very opaque system. And I think there's a sense in which a little bit of sunlight would be a good disinfectant. And so I think there would be some value in sort of making things a little bit more transparent, whether that's, requiring more data be made available, whether that's, sort of changing the contractual arrangements, that might allow us to better see how we can make those additional marginal improvements. So if I have to say my biggest recommendation is always like more transparency, more understanding what's going on. It's hard, like, look, I've thought about this for a long time, and there's a bunch of data that I just can't get a hold of, right? That just doesn't exist for folks like me to analyze. And I think that would be, in fact, quite useful. So I think the answer is probably yes, and we don't quite know what it is, but sunlight is the best disinfectant.
So speaking of opacity, we're getting a lot of questions about everyone's favorite PBM. So let's talk a little bit about
Which one is
PBMs.
everyone's favorite?
Well, I don't know. I think I just misspoke. I was trying to be like a little snappy and just confused
Everyone's
everyone.
favorite entity, the pharmacy benefit manager.
There you go. Let's switch roles. You do both roles. All right. So I want to, this is actually a nice transition question. So can you talk about the original intent of the PBM versus their current role, if those are at all different? And then sort of like a counterfactual, like how does this work in other countries where PBMs like aren't a thing?
Good. I mean, in other countries, PBMs aren't a thing because the government has a set of administered rules that take care of the PBM function, and that has pros and cons. So how do we end up with PBMs in the US? Well, we have insurance, but like I said, initially, like drugs aren't the biggest part of it. And like negotiating drug prices and figuring out which pharmacy to send you to is sort of not the core competency of your insurance company. And so they might want to outsource that. Although at this point, they've generally insourced by acquisition a bunch of PBM functions. And so, the basic idea is, any given insurer has some patients, and we'll be able to negotiate a discount. But if we band together, we can negotiate a bigger discount. And that's sort of how you end up with PBMs in the first place. And I think it's helpful to remember that that is sort of the primary thing that they're doing. So the sort of, the idea that PBMs are sort of evil forgets the fact that they are the ones that are negotiating lower prices for manufacturers. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that there aren't that many of them. And so it's not obvious that they have to pass those savings on to consumers. And so I think here's a place where competition would probably do folks a lot of good, because it would make some of those contractual arrangements clearer. It would make it more likely that they have to pass through the savings to your health insurer, and your health insurer passes it on to you. And so I think it is worth pointing out that PBMs have an important role to play in the system because they do provide this counterweight to these monopoly drug manufacturers, where we gave them the monopoly on purpose, but they are a monopolist. And so we provide that counterbalance in negotiating lower prices. And the question is, what happens to those savings? And if you have a competitive market for those services, then those savings are going to get passed on to the end consumer.
And so you see them as adding a unique value that could not be solved with just like full transparency, where like companies are maybe doing their own negotiating without the middleman.
Yeah, so I don't think companies want to do their own negotiating without the middleman, right? And in fact, insurers, have bought up a bunch of the PBMs, or like CVS Aetna has its own PBM. And so, we can think about this being a job that a health insurer is meant to do, and that's fine. But the idea that any individual consumer or even a large employer like Northwestern wants to negotiate on their own with Pfizer is kind of silly, right? We need to put a bunch of these consumers together and sort of create this mechanism through which drug companies are willing to offer these discounts. And so that is valuable. And we just have to sort of think about making sure that there's enough competition that those savings get passed on to consumers.
And speaking of a lot of, it also seems like a lot of the PBMs are no longer independent, as you've sort of like been hinting at,
Yeah.
and maybe on both sides of the transaction. So can you talk a little bit about, is this good? Is it bad? Do we not even have the data to say?
We don't know. Yeah, I think this is a place where having more data to be able to say would be quite valuable. Now, it's worth saying that just because I don't have the data doesn't mean no one has the data. So one of the things the Federal Trade Commission is currently doing is they're currently doing, I think it's called a Section 6 study, sort of thinking about the level of competition within this industry. And the nice thing about being the Federal Trade Commission and not me is that you have some subpoena power, I think. And so getting a little bit more information, and they're going to start releasing those reports relatively soon. And so thinking a little bit more about how we ensure competition in that part of the sector, I think is important.
So looking forward, I think certain recent advances with expensive drugs like Ozempic, as well as advancements in personalized medicine, these are incredibly promising. It's hard to even kind of wrap our minds around the things that these could do. They're also incredibly expensive. So can our system afford to get, to increase access for these drugs, or alternatively, for philosopher Amanda, can we afford not to?
Okay, good. So, I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. So first, I think we don't want to look at drug cost in isolation. We want to look at this as part of the overall package of healthcare goods and services that we consume in the interest of generating health. And so what does that mean? It means that if taking a drug like Ozempic, which I'm not sure that we fully have the clinical data on this yet, but we'll find out pretty soon. There's sort of a couple of points here. We are certain this causes weight loss. Does it also reduce the cost elsewhere in the system because it reduces cardiovascular disease or something like that? If that's the case, then that profit maximizing insurer who's not super interested in generously covering those infusion treatments might offer more generous coverage of Ozempic, right? Because it saves money somewhere else in the system. And I've done a little bit of work documenting that exact phenomenon. So that's not just like, local professor says this is possible. We've documented this in the data. And so, that's a place where we could imagine saving somewhere else in the system. It's also worth pointing out that these drugs will be expensive temporarily, but eventually, the market exclusivity will run out, and then we'll have, if this is so valuable, we then have it forever, right? At relatively low cost. Personalized medicine is a little bit harder to wrap our heads around because it's probably not the case that this is ever going to get dramatically cheaper just because the production process is so much more involved. Like if I'm taking your own cells to fight your cancer, then that is a sort of bespoke treatment. And there's never going to be any economies of scale. It might still be worth doing on a couple of dimensions. So in terms of clinical benefit, we have turned cancers that are a death sentence into a chronic condition. At the same time, it also might lower overall cost. And so I think it's important to think about the overall cost, not just the drug cost. And also to think about the value that we're creating. And so as we're sort of muddling through that democratic process of figuring out what we want to make sure our fellow citizens have access to, I think these are meaningful conversations to have, right? Because if, when I'm deciding how many boxes of Honey Nut Cheerios to buy, who cares? It's my money. It's kind of none of your business. But, when we're talking about healthcare, it often is someone else's money or the taxpayer's money. And so we have to have those hard conversations. I think those are conversations worth having, but the conversation that we need to have is about the value being created and the overall cost, not just the drug cost.
Well, you timed that perfectly. You finished your answer at exactly 1. We are at time. I want to thank everyone who attended this webinar and sent in such awesome questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them. Thanks especially to Professor Amanda Starc. Please be on the lookout for more from Professor Amanda Starc. She features heavily in an upcoming podcast mini-series that Kellogg Insight is putting out about the economics of healthcare. And we hope to see you again for our discussion with Professor Nicola Persico on the 29th about whether the future of the US economy is Italy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.